It's always refreshing to see a major publisher like Ubisoft occasionally pushing out brand new IPs, rather than trotting out an endless parade of sequels in the same old series year after year. That said, Ubisoft's recent track record with new IPs hasn't been particularly fantastic, with the likes of their botched open world Race of the Crew, the disappointing Tom Clancy shooter The Division, and the severely lacking winter sports bell-end simulator Steep all unfortunately springing to mind. But let's not dwell on the past, for Honor is Ubisoft's latest attempt to get a new franchise off the ground, and, unlike its most recent attempts, For Honor tries to do something that's almost entirely new in terms of its mix of genres. At its core, For Honor is a third-person fighting game with strategic elements set in feudal times, starring three factions: the Knights, who are just like British Knights except they bafflingly have American accents, the Nordic Vikings, and the Far Eastern Samurai, although you have to ally with one of these factions for the purposes of the weak metagame that's constantly playing out on the back of the multiplayer. You're still able to pick character classes from any of the factions once you've unlocked them. The star of the show is, without question, the combat system. When squaring off against an opponent, you have to hold the trigger to lock onto them, and then move the right thumbstick to strike one of the three possible guard poses so that you can block enemy attacks carried out from that direction. By observing where your opponent is guarding, you also need to use the right thumbstick to direct your light and heavy sword attacks around their own blocks. Add in a block-breaking barge and a set of class-specific buffs, and you've got a surprisingly satisfying means of dueling with even the most fearsome of opponents. This is exemplified by Duel Mode, one of the 5 multiplayer options available. In Duel, you can elect to fight either an AI or a real player in a fight to the death. This is where the combat system shines, as facing off against real players is a true test of reaction speed and strategy. While the fighters may not have the same breadth of moveset as seen in 2D fighters such as Street Fighter, this actually makes for a purer and easier to learn fighting system. However, the similar Brawl mode is where things start to come unstuck. This is the same as Duel mode, apart from the fact that it's 2 versus 2. This may sound fine in theory, and it usually is when fighting the first opponent. However, as soon as the first warrior falls, his teammate will then find himself facing off against 2 enemies at the same time, and this is where the fatal flaw in the combat system lies. It clearly hasn't been designed with more than one opponent in mind. What is a compelling and intuitive combat system when pitted against one player devolves into a mindless and unwieldy clusterfuck as soon as your opponents multiply. This is even more evident in the next 2 game modes, Skirmish and Elimination. Skirmish is a fairly bog-standard player versus player mode, reminiscent of a deathmatch where 2 teams of 4 face off in a race for points, whereas Elimination does something similar but with only 1 life. Once again, as long as you're fighting against one human-controlled opponent, this is fine, but when up against a team of 4, you'll quickly rediscover the pointless frustration of being outnumbered. Either this, or you can run around cutting opponents down from behind while one of your teammates keeps them busy, but this is precisely as dull as it sounds. And so that leaves Dominion, which sees 2 teams fighting over control points which have to be cleared of enemy presence. This mode feels reminiscent of a cross between a MOBA, in terms of how you have to mindlessly cut through swathes of computer-controlled minions before snapping into action whenever you encounter a real player, and one of the Warriors games, but without the arcade immediacy of its particular breed of hack-and-slash action. Again, on paper this sounds like it has a huge amount of potential for tactical battles and team communication, but, alas, involves the same exercise in frustration as every one-on-one duel you enter into very quickly is interrupted by one or more of your opponent's teammates. Hanging on the back of all of this is a metagame that involves an ongoing fight between the 3 selectable factions, winning or losing territory depending upon how everyone performs in the multiplayer matches. While this occasionally gives up currency that can be used to customise your characters, the whole affair comes across like a grifter hopping on one leg and waving a flag in front of you so you don't notice his mates emptying out your house behind you. The single player campaign seems to be present almost entirely to run you through all of the character classes and movesets in order to train you up for multiplayer, but is interminably hamstrung by a weak story and an increasingly repetitive series of set pieces. One area where the game doesn't disappoint is with its visuals. Even on the base PS4 and Xbone, the game looks absolutely superb, with solidly rendered shiny knights and warriors mixing it up around venues that could be plucked from Game of Thrones, such as their visual splendour. The wide customization options for your characters really help you to appreciate this side of the game too, as you can play around with everything from your emblem to armour decorations and war paint. That is, once you've actually unlocked the different classes, as, like with Rainbow Six Siege, you need to build up in-game currency in order to purchase them for use. However, building up this currency here is annoyingly slow, making the whole process of unlocking later classes an irritating grind. Now, why would Ubisoft make unlocking characters in the full price game you've just bought such a chore? Surely they wouldn't be infesting the game with microtransactions, trying to tempt you or even frustrate you into unlocking the characters with real money, would they? Well, yes, apparently they would. This isn't the only questionable decision Ubi has made in terms of the game's design. As is becoming ever more common, For Honor requires an online connection at all times, and the game emphasises the multiplayer options. Despite this, and the fact that For Honor has been subjected to several beta tests prior to its release, the online matchmaking is utterly terrible. It's slow, even straight after release when loads of people are playing it, and is ridiculously unreliable, either dropping out before it's finished or just throwing you into a game with several AI bots instead of the real players you were looking for. Compounding all of this is the bizarre decision not to provide dedicated servers. Because, in a multiplayer-focused, full-price game teeming with unnecessary microtransactions and an overpriced season pass, why should Ubisoft bother including a stable environment for their customers to play in when they can just push out a crappy peer-to-peer multiplayer system that relies on people's ropey home connections? There's also some disparity in the quality of the gameplay between the console and PC versions. While the console versions never venture above 30 frames per second, the PC, with its uncapped frame rate, seems to conspicuously handle input lag much better. We played both the base PS4 and PC versions of the game and noticed that the PS4 version felt noticeably heavier and less responsive. We just don't understand how For Honor has ended up being released in such a terrible state, even putting aside the awful online infrastructure, the disappointing campaign, and the input lag issues. The fact is that For Honor's combat system seems to have been designed by a totally different team to the online multiplayer modes that it's been plonked into. Outside of one-on-one duels, the combat system falls to pieces, and this has a knock-on effect to how much enjoyability can be eked out of the game as a whole. Frankly, we found it really hard to carry on playing because, as it stands, For Honor is fundamentally broken, and that makes it really difficult to score. Yes, the combat system is good in certain situations, but most of those situations do not appear in the game that is currently being sold. Maybe Ubisoft will fix the many severe issues plaguing For Honor, but we're reviewing the game that released earlier this week for how it plays now, and that game gets a score from us of 60%. If or when Ubisoft decide to fix it, we'll happily take another look. Probably. If we've got nothing else on that week.